There's something surreal about the night before your wedding. A quiet hum of excitement beneath the surface, the finality of it all wrapping around you like a heavy cloak. It's the last time you'll ever sleep as a single man. The last time you'll wake up without a ring on your finger. At least, that's what I thought. I had spent the entire day tying up loose ends, finalizing guest lists, confirming arrangements with vendors, and handling the million other tiny details that come with planning a wedding. Everything had been falling into place perfectly, or so I believed. Madeline had been at the Beaumont estate with her bridesmaids for the past few days, enjoying what she called her pre-wedding retreat. I hadn't seen her much, but I didn't mind. After all, tomorrow was supposed to be our beginning. I figured she deserved to enjoy these last moments as an unmarried woman. That night, I was sitting in my apartment, staring at the velvet box in my hands. A delicate necklace, passed down through Madeline's family for generations. Her grandmother had given it to me the week before, eyes twinkling with the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to recognize real love. "Give this to her the night before your wedding," she had said, pressing my hand with warm, papery fingers. "Let her wear it down the aisle. It will bring you both good fortune." Looking back, I wish I had crushed the damn thing beneath my heel. I grabbed my keys and decided to drive over to the estate. It wasn't far, just a few minutes away, but I figured surprising Madeline would be a nice gesture. Something sweet to remind her that I was thinking of her even in the chaos of the wedding preparations. I pulled up to the grand gates of the Beaumont estate, a sprawling mansion nestled in the heart of the city. The kind of place where old money whispered in the walls, where every chandelier told a story of power and privilege. The staff recognized my car immediately, letting me in without question. I had become a familiar presence here over the past 3 years. The house was alive with laughter, the distant clinking of glasses, and the faint strains of music. Once someone better comes along, he's out. Something inside me shattered. Not in a dramatic, movie-like way where glass rains down and emotions explode. No, this was worse. It was silent, cold. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, my fingers clenching the necklace so tightly I could feel the delicate chain biting into my skin. The woman I had loved, the woman I had planned a future with, saw me as nothing more than a placeholder, a stepping stone. I felt sick. 3 years. 3 years of love, of laughter, of whispered dreams about the future. All of it had been a carefully crafted performance, and I had been the fool clapping in the audience. I could have burst into the room, could have demanded an explanation, could have thrown the necklace at her feet and watched the shock spread across her face. But that would have been too easy for her. No, she had just rewritten the script, and I had no intention of giving her the ending she expected. I turned on my heel and walked out, not toward heartbreak, not toward sorrow, but toward revenge. There was no heartbreak, no tears, no dramatic scene of me sitting in the dark, drowning in whiskey while replaying her words over and over in my head. That would have given her too much power. Instead, I drove home in complete silence, my mind as sharp as a blade, cutting through every illusion I had ever held about Madeline Beaumont. By the time I stepped inside my penthouse, I wasn't a devastated groom. I was a man on a mission. I sat down, placed the velvet box with the necklace on my desk, and opened my laptop. If Madeline saw me as a stepping stone, then it was time for me to dig up the path she had paved for herself. Madeline came from old money. That much was obvious. But her family's wealth wasn't just some passive inheritance collecting dust in trust funds. Beaumont Enterprises was a powerhouse in corporate investments, and as her fiancé, and soon-to-be husband, I had access to certain financial records. I logged into my shared business portal, scanning through recent transactions. "I need a private investigator," I told my most trusted legal contact. "Someone who can work fast. I want surveillance, records, and every single transaction she's ever tried to hide." By the time I hung up, I had a full-scale investigation in motion, and I wasn't done. I sent an anonymous tip to a financial crimes unit that I knew would take the bait. If they did even a surface-level dig into her offshore accounts, it would be enough to raise red flags. This wasn't just about getting even anymore. It was about making sure she never did this to anyone else. I spent the rest of the night carefully planning how this would all unfold. I wasn't going to confront her privately. That would give her room to lie, to manipulate, to weave a new story. No, I was going to let the whole world see her for who she truly was. The wedding was tomorrow. Every powerful businessman, investor, and politician in our network would be there. Reporters would be covering it for high society columns. The whole world would be watching. Perfect. I would wait until she was standing at the altar, expecting to seal her perfect little deal, and then, boom. I'd expose every lie, every scheme, every betrayal, and I'd watch her crumble in front of everyone she had ever tried to impress. Before heading to bed, I pulled out the necklace, the one her grandmother had entrusted me with, and stared at it for a long moment. Then, with zero hesitation, I dropped it into the trash. Madeline Beaumont was about to learn a lesson, one she would never recover from. The morning of my wedding arrived with an eerie calm. Not the excitement I had expected, not the nerves that people always talked about, just a quiet, chilling sense of finality. I had spent the past few hours executing the last steps of my plan. The private investigator had confirmed everything, the offshore accounts, the fraudulent transactions, and the ongoing affair between Madeline and Dominic Walsh. It was all neatly compiled into a dossier, set to be delivered at the right moment. The final chess piece was in place. Now, it was time to watch it all fall apart. I showered, shaved, and dressed like nothing was wrong. The crisp white tuxedo, the tailored fit, the polished shoes, everything about me screamed perfect groom. I wasn't. By the time I arrived at the Beaumont estate, the air was thick with anticipation. Staff rushed around, finalizing the last-minute details. Florists arranged the grand floral arch, and hundreds of guests were already arriving. Madeline's family had spared no expense. The venue was transformed into an opulent wonderland. White roses, crystal chandeliers, classical musicians playing soft notes of elegance. It was perfect. Perfect for what was about to happen. As I walked through the estate, guests greeted me warmly, unaware that they were about to witness something unforgettable. Madeline's mother, Eleanor Beaumont, beamed as she kissed my cheek. "Lucas, darling, you're going to make my daughter so happy." I smiled back. "I certainly hope so." Madeline's sister, Celeste, adjusted her hat and gave me a teasing grin. "Ready for a lifetime of high society drama?" "Oh, you have no idea." Then came Gerard Beaumont, Madeline's father. He clasped my shoulder with a firm grip, his sharp eyes assessing me. "We're pleased to have you in the family, Lucas. You've done well for yourself." He meant it as a compliment, but there was always an underlying tone in his words, like he was letting me in on a deal rather than a family. I gave a polite nod. "I think today will be full of surprises." His chuckle was one of a man who believed he was always in control. He was about to learn otherwise. The last conversation with my bride, a staff member, pulled me aside. "The bride wants to see you." Just a quick moment before the ceremony, I followed them to a private room where Madeline was getting ready. When I stepped inside, the sight of her almost stopped me. Not because of love, not because I was captivated by her beauty, but because of the sheer irony of it all. She stood in front of a massive mirror, glowing in her wedding gown, a hand-stitched masterpiece of lace and pearls. Her makeup was flawless, her smile radiant with confidence. She had no idea she was standing on the edge of a cliff. She turned, her eyes softening when she saw me. "Lucas, my love," she whispered, stepping toward me. "I can't wait to spend forever with you." "Forever?" I almost laughed. I took her hands in mine, forcing warmth into my touch. "You look breathtaking, Maddie." She beamed, completely unsuspecting. "I know you weren't thrilled about the big wedding," she said, "but this is important for our families. You understand that, right? Our families. Our merger. Not our love." I gave a slow nod. "Of course. Today is going to be unforgettable." Her phone buzzed on the vanity table. A message flashed across the screen. "Dominic Walsh, I can't wait to see you tonight." I looked at her. She followed my gaze, saw what I had seen, and in one swift move, she turned the phone over, hiding it. Then she smiled at me. Fake. Polished. A mask she had worn for years. "See you at the altar," I said, stepping back. And with that, I walked out, leaving the woman who thought she had everything in the world. She had no idea she was about to lose it all. I stepped outside, where the wedding coordinator was organizing the guests. A few rows back, I spotted my planted reporters, already seated, hidden among the high-profile guests. Their cameras would capture everything. Nearby, the legal team and SEC representatives I had tipped off were stationed, waiting for the moment to strike. Everything was in place. Then, my phone buzzed. Private investigator. Final confirmation secured. Financial fraud, wire transfers, and offshore accounts all verified. Police contact on standby. This was it. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, adjusted my tuxedo, and took my position at the front of the aisle. The doors would open in seconds. The music would start. Madeleine Beaumont would walk down the aisle believing she had one, and I would be waiting, not as her future husband, but as the man about to ruin her. One step at a time. The music swelled, filling the grand cathedral with a sense of occasion. Every guest stood, turning toward the massive double doors as they began to swing open. And there she was, Madeleine Beaumont, the bride who had planned to ruin me. She walked down the aisle, glowing with the kind of confidence that only came from believing she had already won. Her designer gown trailed behind her, shimmering under the golden light streaming through the cathedral's stained glass windows. She smiled at me, a rehearsed, dazzling expression, one meant to reassure me that she was mine. She had no idea I was about to destroy her. I stood at the altar, my posture composed, my expression unreadable. Beside me, the officiant, a man who had no idea the chaos about to unfold, smiled warmly. The guests whispered in admiration. I could hear snippets of their conversations. She looks stunning. Such a perfect couple. This is the wedding of the year. They were right about one thing. It would be a wedding no one would ever forget. Madeleine reached the altar, her father, Gerard Beaumont, placing her hand in mine. His grip was firm, a silent warning that I was expected to keep my part of the deal, to marry into this powerful family and play my role. I smiled back at him. You may be seated, the officiant announced, and the guests obediently took their places. The cathedral settled into an expectant hush. Madeleine gazed at me, her eyes shimmering with triumph. She thought I was nervous with anticipation. She thought she had one. I gently let go of her hands. And then, I reached into my jacket pocket. A cream-colored envelope slid into my fingers. Madeleine's smile faltered ever so slightly. She noticed. Before we begin, I said, my voice calm, confident, designed for maximum effect, I have something to share with all of you. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The officiant looked confused. Lucas, this, but I raised a hand, silencing him. I took out the first document from the envelope and unfolded it carefully. My voice was steady. This isn't a reading from the Bible, I said. This is an email. One that my beautiful bride sent to another man while planning our wedding. A gasp. Madeleine stiffened beside me. I continued. Dearest Dominic, I read, my voice ringing through the silent cathedral. Everything is on track. Once Lucas and I are married, I'll have full access to the funds. After that, we can move forward as planned. The guests froze. The whispering turned into shocked murmurs. Madeleine's breath hitched. I turned to look at her, tilting my head slightly. Would you like me to continue, sweetheart? She stammered. Lucas, this is ridiculous. Where did you get? I pulled out the next document. Perhaps you'd prefer to explain this instead? I unfolded another sheet and lifted it for everyone to see. It was a bank transaction receipt, one showing an offshore account in her name. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, I announced, transferred discreetly. And why? I turned to the guests, my gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of investors, CEOs, political figures, and media personnel, because my dear fiancée wasn't just planning to leave me. She was committing fraud. The collapse of Madeleine Beaumont. Madeleine's breathing turned erratic. She reached for me. Whether to plead or silence me, I didn't care. I took a step back. Don't touch me. Gasps. Madeleine was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Her father, Gerard, stood up suddenly, his face red with fury. Madeleine, what is he talking about? Madeline shook her head wildly, trying to salvage what was left. Daddy, it's not true. He's lying. Lucas, please, let's talk in private. I chuckled. Private? Like how you planned to privately replace me the moment your trust fund was unlocked. More gasps. A woman in the front row clutched her pearls. Madeline turned to the guests, searching for allies. But no one met her gaze. Because they knew. I reached into my pocket one last time and pulled out my phone. A simple text. I hit send. Across the room, 3 men in suits entered the cathedral. The SEC agents. The silence was deafening as they approached. One of them, a man in a crisp navy suit, spoke firmly. Madeline Beaumont, we have a warrant to investigate your financial activity. Please step aside. Her entire body shook. No, Daddy. But Gerard wasn't looking at her. His face had gone deathly pale. Because he knew, his daughter had just set fire to the family's empire. The SEC agents moved in. Madeline collapsed to her knees, her wedding gown pooling around her like a ruined fairy tale. Lucas, please. Her voice was barely a whisper now. You can't do this to me. I crouched down, just low enough for only her to hear me. I didn't do this to you, Madeline. You did this to yourself. I straightened. The entire cathedral was in chaos. Reporters already snapping photos, guests murmuring in shock, and Madeline's family scrambling to salvage their reputation. I adjusted my cufflinks, and then, with calm, deliberate steps, I walked away. Down the aisle, out the grand doors, leaving Madeline Beaumont behind. Her carefully constructed world, her empire of deception, collapsed around her. And I didn't look back. I stepped out of the cathedral into the cool afternoon air, the faint hum of disbelief and scandal still vibrating behind me. The doors remained wide open, revealing a fractured world inside. Guests whispering, reporters scrambling, security murmuring into radios. And in the center of it all, Madeline Beaumont, kneeling in her wedding gown like a fallen queen stripped of her crown. She was sobbing, clutching at the last remnants of dignity, but there was none left. Her father, Gerard Beaumont, had yet to move. He stood frozen in the front row, his jaw locked, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. This wasn't just a personal disaster. It was a corporate catastrophe. He knew that now. The Beaumont name had always been synonymous with power, wealth, and untouchable prestige. But today, the name would be plastered on headlines for all the wrong reasons. Security had begun ushering out confused and horrified guests, murmuring reassurances as if they could possibly contain the damage. But they couldn't. This was everywhere. The reporters I had placed among the guests? They were already live-streaming. The SEC agents? They were actively combing through financial statements. The investors in the audience? They were furiously texting their legal teams. There was no undoing this. No rebranding. No escape. I turned, my steps slow and measured, as I made my way toward the edge of the courtyard, where my car was waiting. The roar of the scandal was fading behind me. Then, I heard it. Lucas. Madeline's voice. Raw. Desperate. Breaking. I stopped, but I didn't turn. Footsteps. Unsteady. Rushing. The sound of heels clattering against marble. Then, a hand grabbing my wrist. I exhaled slowly before looking over my shoulder. Madeline stood there, barefoot now, her veil slipping, her carefully styled hair in disarray. The pristine perfection of her bridal look was crumbling, just like everything else around her. She looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years. Fear. The plea for salvation. Lucas, please. Her voice trembled. You don't have to do this. You don't have to ruin me. I stared at her, feeling nothing. Absolutely nothing. This woman, this beautiful, brilliant manipulator, had once been my entire world. And now? Now she was just a mistake I had corrected. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. You still don't get it, do you? She blinked rapidly, as if trying to make sense of the man standing before her. I took a step closer, my voice low, deliberate. You ruined yourself, Madeline. Her grip on my wrist tightened. We can fix this. I smirked. Fix what, exactly? The wedding. The merger. The business. I cut her off with a soft chuckle. Madeline, I just exposed your financial fraud in front of half of the city's most powerful people. Do you honestly think there's anything left to fix? Her face crumpled. You love me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. For the first time in years, I told her the absolute truth. I did. I reached down, gently prying her fingers off my wrist. Not anymore. A gasp left her lips, her body swaying slightly, as if my words had physically struck her. I turned, stepping away. Each movement slow, controlled, final. Madeline watched, helpless, as I walked toward my car. And then, just as I reached for the door handle, "Lucas, please." I sighed. Then, without looking back, I said the last thing I would ever say to her. "Goodbye, Madeline." I slid into my car, the door shutting with a decisive click. And then, I drove away. Away from the scandal. Away from the wreckage. Away from the woman who had tried to break me. The aftermath begins. I didn't go home. Instead, I checked into a private suite at the Carlton Hotel. I had no intention of being bombarded with calls, messages, or desperate apologies from people scrambling to pick a side. From the window, I watched the city move below me, its neon lights flickering to life as dusk settled in. Then, my phone buzzed. I ignored it. It buzzed again, and again. Finally, I sighed, flipping it over. The first notification? Breaking news. Beaumont wedding turns to scandal as groom exposes fraud at altar. I swiped. Beaumont Enterprises faces investigation. SEC officials present at ceremony. Another one. Dominic Walsh declines to comment on his involvement with Madeline Beaumont. I chuckled. Of course he did. Then, finally, a text. Not from Madeline. From her sister, Celeste. "Celeste, I don't know whether to thank you or hate you. But I do know one thing. She deserved it." I stared at my screen for a long moment before typing a response. Me? She did. I put my phone down. Tomorrow, the full fallout would begin. Madeline's arrest was inevitable. Her family's empire? It would collapse under the weight of its own deception. And me? I was finally free. I woke up the next morning feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because everything was over. Far from it. The fallout was just beginning. But because for the first time since I met Madeline Beaumont, I had nothing to lose. No illusions to maintain. No lies to untangle. No future to salvage. Just a clean break from the wreckage of a life I had almost been trapped in. The world outside my hotel suite was already in chaos. I picked up my phone, scrolling through the news. The wedding from hell. Lucas Harrington exposes bride's fraud at altar. Socialite Madeline Beaumont under SEC investigation. Could face charges. Beaumont family in crisis. Gerard Beaumont refuses TO comment. I smirked. She was officially ruined. The moment I walked out of that church, Madeline's carefully crafted empire collapsed. Her bank accounts? Frozen. Her business deals? Disintegrating. Her family? Turning against her to save themselves. I saw a new article pop up. Sources confirm that Dominic Walsh, high-profile investor and alleged affair partner, has severed ties with the Beaumonts and is distancing himself from Madeline. I let out a low laugh. So much for her backup plan. The man she had risked everything for? He was running. My phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I knew exactly who it was. I let it ring. Seconds later, a text popped up. "Madeline, Lucas, please. Just talk to me." I stared at the message, then deleted it. No response. She had already spoken enough. Turning the tables, I got dressed, put on a crisp suit, and left the hotel. Not for revenge. Not for closure. But for business. By the time I stepped into my office, the sharks were already circling. My legal team, my financial advisors, my business partners. They had one question. What's next? I smiled. We moved forward. Madeline thought she had been playing a long game. But what she didn't realize was that I had always been the better strategist. She was out of moves. And I was just getting started. Waking up the morning after exposing Madeline Beaumont wasn't like waking up after a victory. There was no rush of euphoria, no celebration, just silence. A deep, settling silence that comes when you realize you've just burned an entire chapter of your life to the ground. And yet, I had never felt lighter. I sat up in the dim glow of my hotel suite, staring out over the city skyline. The same city that had once whispered my name alongside hers, believing we were destined for greatness together. Now, those whispers had turned into headlines. I reached for my phone, already vibrating with notifications. The media had wasted no time. Breaking news alerts. The wedding that never was. Lucas Harrington walks away from Madeline Beaumont at the altar. Billionaire bride-to-be exposed for fraud. SEC launches immediate investigation. Beaumont empire in crisis. Gerard Beaumont faces backlash from investors. I smirked. It was happening even faster than I expected. I scrolled through my texts. From my lawyer. The SEC has already frozen several of their assets. The offshore accounts you leaked? Solid evidence of financial misconduct. This could escalate into full-blown criminal charges. Good. I had no interest in watching Madeline suffer. I had only wanted to make sure she could never do to anyone else what she tried to do to me. By noon, it was clear. Madeline wasn't just socially ruined. She was legally ruined. Investors were backing out of Beaumont Enterprises, stock prices were crashing, and every major news outlet had picked up the scandal. Even Dominic Walsh, the man Madeline had planned to replace me with, had gone silent. Of course, he had. Men like Dominic didn't fall in love. They made investments. And Madeline? She was no longer a profitable one. I had expected it. The call from Gerard Beaumont. I let it go to voicemail. Then another. And another. Until finally, a text. Gerard Beaumont. We need to talk. Name your price. I laughed. He still thought this was a negotiation. That I had done this for power. But the truth? I had done this for myself. For every man who had ever been used. For every person who had ever been manipulated into believing a lie. I deleted the text. There was nothing left to say. By evening, a new headline surfaced. Madeline Beaumont speaks out, claims she was manipulated by her inner circle. I clicked on the article, already knowing what I'd find. Her damage control. A carefully crafted story spinning herself as the victim. I was surrounded by people who influenced me in the wrong ways. I let ambition cloud my judgment. I loved Lucas, and I regret everything. I chuckled. She still thought she could control the story. Still thought she could play on my emotions the way she had for years. I closed the article without reading further. She could lie to the world all she wanted. The truth? She had already lost. That night, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I went out. Alone. No entourage. No high society events. Just me, a quiet bar, and a whiskey glass. For the first time in years, I wasn't playing a role. I wasn't some wealthy fiancé with expectations to meet. I wasn't a business deal in the making. I was just Lucas, a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side. I had no interest in meeting anyone that night, but fate had other plans. She walked into the bar like she belonged there. Not a woman who sought attention. Not a woman who needed validation. Just someone who carried herself like she knew exactly who she was. I barely glanced at her until she ordered a drink. Then I heard it. Neat. No ice. No nonsense. I looked up. She caught my gaze and raised a brow. What? Never met a woman who skips the sugar? A smirk tugged at my lips. Just not one who calls it out so directly. She wasn't like the women I was used to. She didn't lean forward with practiced charm. She didn't ask about my last name, my net worth, my business portfolio. She just took a sip of her drink and glanced at the TV screen behind the bar, where my own face was still plastered across the news. Her lips quirked. Rough week? I huffed a quiet laugh. You could say that. Well, she said, clinking her glass against mine, here's to surviving it. I lifted my drink, and for the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't thinking about Madeline. I wasn't thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what came next. By the end of the week, the SEC had filed formal charges against Madeline Beaumont. Fraud, embezzlement, financial manipulation. The evidence was too overwhelming for her to escape. Her own father had cut her off, desperate to salvage what little remained of their reputation. The woman who once stood above everyone was now alone. I never saw her again. Never responded to her desperate messages. Never acknowledged her public pleas for redemption. Because some doors don't deserve to be reopened. And some people don't deserve a second chance. A life without her a year later, my business had tripled in value. Not because of the scandal, but because I had rebuilt it without distraction, without lies, without someone scheming behind my back. And love? It found me in the most unexpected way. Not in the grand, dramatic, high-society courtship I once thought I needed, but in small moments. Conversations over drinks. Honest laughs that didn't feel like a performance. A woman who challenged me instead of needing to be impressed. And when I looked at her, I saw something Madeline had never given me. Something real. Madeline had spent her entire life trying to control people, trying to buy power, trying to build an empire on deception. And me? I had spent years being her greatest investment. But now, I had something she could never touch. A life built on truth. A future built on strength. And a love that didn't need to be bought. So, to answer the question everyone had asked me since that day at the altar, did I regret exposing her? Did I regret walking away? Not for a single second. Because the best revenge wasn't destroying Madeline. The best revenge was never needing revenge at all. For a long time, I convinced myself that love wasn't for me. Not real love, anyway. After Madeline, after the betrayal, after standing at the altar and watching my entire world collapse in the best way possible, I swore off the idea entirely. It wasn't worth the risk. I had been a fool once, and that was enough. So, I buried myself in my work. I focused on rebuilding my empire, cutting out all distractions, and ensuring I would never be played again. And yet, it wasn't a love story. It wasn't some dramatic, lightning strike moment where I saw a woman across the room, and everything changed. It was slow. It was unexpected. It was Serena Caldwell. She was brought in as an ethics consultant for my company, part of the internal overhaul we conducted after the Madeline scandal shook up the industry. Her job was simple: to audit, to assess, to ensure there were no cracks in our foundation. But from the moment we spoke, I realized she was nothing like Madeline. She didn't flirt to get her way. She didn't charm to manipulate. She didn't care about who I was or what I owned. She was here to do a job, and she did it brilliantly. Serena wasn't interested in power. She wasn't looking for a last name to elevate her status. She was already successful on her own, and more importantly, she had something I hadn't encountered in a long time: integrity. She wasn't afraid to challenge me. She wasn't intimidated by my wealth, my reputation, or my past. She asked hard questions. She pushed back when she thought I was wrong. She didn't tiptoe around me like everyone else did. And for the first time in years, I found myself drawn to someone, not because I wanted them, but because I respected them. That was new. That was real. At first, it was just business. Discussions in the boardroom, phone calls at odd hours, email exchanges that were always straight to the point. But then, the conversations lingered. After-hours meetings turned into long talks about life. Business discussions turned into personal debates. She would challenge me in ways I hadn't been challenged before. Not aggressively, not manipulatively, but with honest curiosity. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked one night, after a particularly brutal investor meeting. I looked up from my whiskey glass. "Regret what?" She tilted her head, walking away, exposing her. I smirked. Not for a second. She studied me for a moment. Good. Then she leaned back, sipping her drink. "You shouldn't." That was the moment I realized. She wasn't looking for a weakness to exploit. She wasn't waiting for an angle to use. She was just getting to know me. And that scared me more than anything. Because no one had done that in a long time. I don't know when it happened. There was no defining moment. No grand declaration. Just a shift. I caught myself looking forward to our conversations. I caught myself trusting her. I caught myself thinking that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to keep my guard up forever. Then one evening, over dinner, she looked at me and said something that changed everything. "You don't have to be the man she turned you into." I stared at her. "What?" She leaned forward, her eyes steady. "I know you built yourself back up after her. I know you swore off trust, off relationships. I know you're careful now." She smiled, but it wasn't mocking. It wasn't manipulative. It was understanding. But you don't have to live your whole life proving you're untouchable. I didn't respond, because for the first time, I didn't know what to say. She was right. I had spent so long making sure no one could get close enough to hurt me again that I never stopped to think. What if someone got close for the right reasons? What if not everyone was Madeline? What if I was finally allowed to move on? Serena didn't ask for anything from me. She didn't expect gifts. She didn't demand my time. She didn't try to mold herself into what she thought I wanted. She was just herself, and for the first time, I saw the difference. Madeline had been beautiful, powerful, intoxicating. She had been a game I thought I was winning, until I realized I was nothing more than a pawn. But Serena? She was steady. She was strong without needing to prove it. She was the kind of woman who didn't need me, but chose me anyway. And that was the first time I had ever experienced something real. One night, as we walked through the city after dinner, she glanced at me. "You still think about her, don't you?" I was quiet for a moment, then I shook my head. "No, I think about who I was when I was with her." Serena didn't push. She just nodded, because she understood. I had spent years defining myself by what I had lost, by who had betrayed me, by the moment I walked away from Madeline at the altar. But now, I was finally defining myself by what I had gained, by who I had become, by the man I was when I was with Serena. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Serena and I weren't a perfect love story. There was no fairy tale, no Hollywood romance, just two people who had seen the worst of the world and chose each other anyway. She didn't try to own me. She didn't try to use me. She just stayed. And that was all I ever needed. Looking back, I don't regret Madeline. Not because I loved her, not because I miss her, but because she taught me exactly what love isn't. And in doing so, she led me to the woman who taught me what love truly is. The kind that doesn't ask for power. The kind that doesn't demand sacrifice. The kind that doesn't leave you empty. The kind that makes you stronger. And that was the first time I ever truly won. Closure isn't always about getting an apology. Sometimes, it's about realizing you don't need one. For the longest time, I thought revenge meant watching Madeline suffer, that exposing her, watching her world collapse, and ensuring she never had the life she planned for herself would give me the satisfaction I deserved. And in some ways it did. She was nothing more than a lesson I had already learned. Her downfall was complete. Beaumont Enterprises had collapsed. Her father had disowned her. Dominic Walsh, the man she had bet everything on, had abandoned her. And Madeline? She was a forgotten name, no longer feared, no longer admired, no longer important. For someone like her, that was worse than any prison sentence. I didn't need to respond to her letter. She had finally learned what I had known for a long time. She had lost me long before I walked away. It wasn't until Serena entered my life that I truly understood what love was supposed to be. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about control. It wasn't about who was winning or who was losing. It was about partnership. Serena never needed me to prove my worth. She never tried to mold herself into what she thought I wanted. She was just herself. And that was enough. We didn't rush. We didn't force it. It happened slowly. Until one day, I realized I wasn't thinking about Madeline anymore. I wasn't living in the past. I wasn't carrying the weight of what had been done to me. I was finally, fully free. 3 years after I walked away from the altar, I found myself standing at another one. But this time, there were no headlines. No business deals disguised as romance. No hidden agendas. Just Serena and me. A small gathering. Family. Friends. A quiet promise. A vow that meant something. She slid the ring onto my finger. Her hands steady, her eyes clear. "This is real, Lucas." And for the first time in my life, I believed it. Looking back, I don't regret Madeline. Not because I loved her. Not because I miss her. But because she taught me exactly what love isn't. And in doing so, she led me to the woman who taught me what love truly is. The kind that doesn't ask for power. The kind that doesn't demand sacrifice. The kind that doesn't leave you empty. The kind that makes you stronger. And that was the first time I ever truly won.